Norman Mineta was 10 years old when he left his home in San Jose, California, and relocated to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Over the next few years, Norman experienced what it was like to live in an internment camp for Japanese Americans. Overview by Roger Daniels. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a sneak attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date that would live in infamy. America declared war against Japan the next day. Overnight, Japanese Americans found their lives changed. 74 days after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. The order forced over 110,000 Japanese Americans to leave their homes in California, Washington, and Oregon. They were sent to live in one of 10 detention camps in the desolate parts of the United States. None of the Japanese Americans had been charged with a crime against the government. 2/3 had been born in the United States, and more than 70% of people forced into camps were American citizens. Roosevelt's actions were supported by Congress without a single vote against it, and was eventually upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. Yet many scholars came to believe that this order was a day of infamy, as far as the Constitution and civil rights were concerned. The people forced into camps were deprived of their liberty, a basic freedom of the American Constitution. The government called these camps relocation centers. Surrounded by barbed wires and guarded by armed soldiers, families lived in poorly built, overcrowded barracks. The barracks themselves had no running water and little heat. There was almost no privacy, and almost everyone had to use public bathrooms. The camp provided medical care and school for Japanese Americans. As time went by, more and more individuals, mostly young adults, were released to do farm and defense work, go to college, and even serve in the military. Almost 50 years later, the American Congress passed, and President Ronald W. Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which formally apologized for its wartime imprisonment of these innocent people and awarded each of the 80,000 survivors to $20,000 payment. Why were Japanese Americans moved out of their homes and into camps, especially when German and Italian Americans were not? There have been numerous explanations. Perhaps the best explanation was given by the Presidential Commission that recommended the 1988 apology. The commission said that the broad historical causes were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Widespread ignorance of Japanese Americans contributed to a policy of conceived in haste and executed in an atmosphere of fear and anger at Japan. It is important to remember this was before the Civil Rights Movement. Racism against people of color, Asians, Latins, and African Americans was common. Because they were easily identifiable as being Asians, Japanese Americans felt more racial hatred than German Americans and Italian Americans. In addition, Japan put together an impressive string of victories in the first 6 months of the war, overwhelming U.S. troops in the Philippines, sinking many U.S. ships, and conquering much of Southeast Asia. Their victories led to U.S. paranoia, and many people thought that their Japanese neighbors could be spies. These victories, combined with racism, created a war hysteria. Many people were afraid, and they thought the only way that the Americans could be safe was to put the Japanese Americans in camp. This fear continued through most of World War II, even when it was clear that Japan was losing the war. Most of the Japanese Americans were kept in camps well into 1944. The last camp did not close until March 1946, 7 months after the war had ended. Norman Mineta's story is just one boy's experience of living in an internment camp. Every Japanese American from this time in history has his or her own story to tell. This is Norman's. By Norman Mineta from an interview by Duff Griffith for the Japanese American Project of the Oral History Program at California State University, Fullerton. Before the war. I was born and raised in San Jose, California. Both of my parents had been born in Japan. My father moved to America in 1902, and my mom came over in 1912. Being first-generation American, I was considered Niesi. Living in California, we all experienced some subtle forms of discrimination, like waiting in a department store for a clerk to help you, while other people who came in after you got waited first. My family had strong feelings about America, especially my father. You see, there were many immigrants who came to America to work, make money, and later return to Japan. But there are also many who came with the intention of raising their families and becoming a permanent part of the fabric society. In the late 1920s, my dad helped put together a support group of Japanese immigrants in San Jose who wanted to become Americans. Consequently, he had strong relationships with the city and county officials and the business community. He had made many friends. There was only 3 times when I had seen my dad cry. Once, on the 7th of December, 1941. The second time was when we left on the train to go to camp, and the third was when my mother passed away. I remember on the 7th of December when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. He was in the little office at home crying and saying, "Why did they do that? Why? Why?" Now, let's think about it. Why do you think it was so hard for Norman's family on December 7th, 1941? Leaving home. Soon after Pearl Harbor, the evacuation notices were posted. Then came the tension and the anxiety of what do we do now? All of our things had to be packed and stored because we could only take those things which we could carry. We had to sell our car, a relatively new Packard, and for a very low price compared to what we had paid for it. People knew that there were all sorts of distress sales going on, whether it was a person who had a store and had to get rid of his merchandise, or a farmer who had to make arrangements for his farmland. There was just a lot of things that had to be done in a very short period of time. We could feel the tension, and it all culminated on May 29, 1942, when we boarded the trains to go to the Santa Anita Assembly Center outside of Los Angeles. This was a famous horse racing track that they had turned into an internment camp. While my parents were stressed and sad, it was a little different for me. I was a boy going on a long train ride. It was really the first long train ride I'd ever been on. I had taken the train to San Francisco several times, but nothing like this overnight train. I was so excited. I asked my mother if I could wear my Cub Scout uniform that day. I didn't go to school when we were at Santa Anita, and it was there that I saw a riot involving 2,000 or 3,000 people. It had started when the Santa Anita officials distributed a list of contraband articles. Hand irons, knives larger than 4 or 5 inches, AM radios. Well, one day the army came through and started to inspect the barracks for contraband articles, and people really got up in arms about this invasion of privacy. Before we knew it, there was a full-scale riot, and the military police, complete with jeeps armed with machine guns, came in to put it down. I remember my friend and I sitting on the fence of the practice field next to the racetrack as the riot was going on. We sat there while the bullets went zinging by us. Here we were, 10-year-old kids. We ran up and tried to peer through the brush to see more of what was going on. We were not really in the crossfire, but we were close enough to hear bullets winging by us. When I think about it now, I sort of laugh and think about how lucky we really were. This was a full-scale riot. Of course, as a 10-year-old, my response was, "Wow, look at the weapons, look at the tanks, and look at the jeeps, all that stuff coming in." To others, it had a very different impact. Now, let's think about it. Why was the tension so high for Norman's parents and other Japanese Americans selling off and packing up their belongings? Heart Mountain. Soon after the riots, we left Santa Anita and were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Heart Mountain was really out in the middle of nowhere. Even if we did get out of camp, there really wasn't anywhere you could go. Yet the camp was still surrounded by a fence and guarded by military police. To give you an idea of how strictly the camp was guarded, I have a story about how a little game almost got me into trouble. One time, my friend Eddie Kimura and I were sledding. It was great to get into a big box in the wintertime, find a little hill, and just go tumbling down, letting the slippery snow and the wind push you down. This time, as we were sliding along, we wound up sliding right under the fence. So there we were, 2 11-year-olds being picked up in the Jeep by military police and accused of trying to break out of camp. We were scared out of our wits. We were taken to the barrage, and where I remember sitting and crying and promising, "No, we won't ever do it again." They made my dad come down to pick us up. He didn't punish us, but he thought we ought to be more careful, otherwise we might get shot. Now, let's think about it. What would it be like to be picked up by the military police and arrested just for sledding? Life in the camp. Heart Mountain was the largest of the relocation camps, with about 10,000 people living there. We lived in barracks, and each family had a room of about 15 wide by 25 feet long. This would house a family of anywhere from 4 to 7 people. This was your living room and bedroom. Each one had a potbelly stove for warmth, one light, and an army cot for each person. Everything was right in this one room. I would say that the length was all right, but width-wise it was a little narrow. Because our living space was so small, we were closely supervised as kids. To use the bathroom, we went to shared lanterns. To eat, we went to the mess hall. We ate as a family, but not in our room. We had meal tickets that corresponded to a mess hall, the yellow mess, the red mess, or the blue mess. And you would come through the line, and the mess steward would punch your ticket for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. We also had a governmental structure in camp where each block would have a block council, and the block council would then elect a block manager. My dad was a block manager. We had some flare-ups in the Heart Mountain, but nothing like the riot. Once, a rock was thrown through our barracks window. This was because some people did not agree with my family's beliefs. My brother-in-law was very active in the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL. JACL decided in the beginning of the war to cooperate with the U.S. government because that would prove our American patriotism. JACL was going to cooperate fully with the authorities in making sure that relocation went off as smoothly as possible. Other Japanese Americans did not believe that we should cooperate with the American government because the camps were unconstitutional, and they knew that my brother-in-law was the executive director of the JACL. I think it was those people who objected to the JACL's position who threw the rocks and broke 2 of our windows. Now, let's think about it. What do you think would be the hardest part about living in the camps from day to day? Life after the war. We lived together at Heart Mountain until April 1943, when my dad got a job teaching Japanese at the University of Chicago under the Army Specialized Training Program. My mother and I were not able to join him until November 1943, when we moved to Illinois. We lived there for the duration of the war. When the war ended, the West Coast was reopened to those of Japanese ancestry. We then returned to San Jose, where I graduated from high school. In 1962, my wife and I visited Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Part of the reason for going back was just curiosity to see what was remaining of the camp. What I saw in 1962 was quite different from what I remembered from when I was a kid. For one thing, that area was a desert, and the land was not good for growing anything. When people moved into the camps, they started to use the land for growing food. They set in their own drainage and irrigation systems. The Shoshone River ran nearby, and they created a canal system and a number of irrigation projects for their own, which made the place productive in terms of farm products. Years later, their irrigation projects allowed others to start their own ranches. I have no rancor or bitterness from the evacuation experience, but we were always products of our experiences. I think that my experiences have led to my feelings about government. Starting in the early 1960s, I started to work in politics. I became the mayor of San Jose and later represented San Jose in Congress, where I helped pass the Civil Liberties Acts of 1988. This act provided former internees and reparations and official apology for the government violations of their civil liberties and constitutional rights. Now, let's think about it. How would you feel if you were evacuated and put into a relocation camp? Would you, like Norman, feel no bitterness?